For today's class, we're going to continue our discussion of the brain, and then we'll also talk about the other structure of the central nervous system, which is the spinal cord. We'll begin by looking at membranes, which are called meninges. Now, understand that the brain is provided with protection by the cranium, which is that bony structure that houses the brain. And the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column. To help provide an additional layer of protection, you have membranes which are called the meninges. The meninges consist of 3 membranes that line the skull and the vertebral canal, and these again help to provide further protection to the brain and the spinal cord. The 3 membranes of the meninges are the dura mater, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. The dura mater is the tough outermost layer, and this is what lines the skull. You have the middle layer, which is the arachnoid, and it's named arachnoid because its appearance is like that of a fine cobweb. And then you have the inner delicate layer, which is called the pia mater, and the pia mater is what covers the brain. Now, located between the meninges, you have these specific spaces. These spaces are the subdural space and the subarachnoid space. The subdural space is the space between the dura mater and the arachnoid. You may have heard of something like an injury called a subdural hematoma, and that is just saying that you have a hematoma or a collection of blood that's located in that subdural space. The subarachnoid space is the space between the pia mater and the arachnoid. And a significant feature of the subarachnoid space is that it is filled with a special fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid bathes the brain, and one of its functions is to provide additional protection. The brain has 4 ventricles, and these ventricles are responsible for the production, transport, and removal of cerebrospinal fluid. The 4 ventricles are as follows: the lateral ventricles, in which you have a left and a right, the 3rd ventricle, and the 4th ventricle. Each of these ventricles is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and the ventricles function to transport that cerebrospinal fluid throughout the brain into the spinal cord. Within the cerebral ventricles is this network of specialized blood vessels called the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is important because this is what produces the cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid, along with providing protection to the brain by acting as a shock absorber, is also an important source for nutrients to the brain. It helps to provide the brain with nutrients that the brain needs, and it also helps to remove waste products from the brain cells. We are now going to talk about the spinal cord. The spinal cord, on average, is about 17 or 18 inches long, and this is for an average height individual. The spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata down to between the 1st and 2nd lumbar vertebrae. The spinal cord enters the spinal column at the beginning of the cervical vertebrae. And in this picture, you can see how the spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae. Like the brain, the spinal cord is also surrounded by the meninges, Again, you have the dura mater, which is that outer protective layer, the arachnoid matter, which is that middle layer that has been described as that cobweb type appearance, and then you have that innermost delicate layer, which is that pia mater, and that is what actually surrounds the spinal cord. There's also, in the spinal cord, you have the subarachnoid space and the subdural space. As you can recall, that subarachnoid space is the space between the pia mater and the arachnoid, and this is filled with that very important cerebrospinal fluid, which helps to protect and nourish the spinal cord. And then you have the subdural space, which is the space between the dura mater and the arachnoid. And this space is important because this is what contains blood vessels that help to nourish the spinal cord. Now, if you were to take a cross-section of the spinal cord, you'll see that it has two different regions. It has a core region, which consists of gray matter. And gray matter is tissue that's composed of cell bodies and unmyelinated axons and dendrites. And then you have an outer portion of the spinal cord, which consists of white matter. The white matter it's white because it has nerves that are covered with myelin, which has a white appearance. And this white matter functions as the wiring of the spinal cord. This is because the white matter is what contains the sensory and motor neurons. The spinal cord functions as a reflex center and a conduction pathway to and from the brain. Within the spinal cord, you have ascending tracts, which conduct impulses up the cord to the brain, and you have descending tracts, which conduct impulses down the cord from the brain. And that concludes our discussion today of the brain and the spinal cord.